Despite being one of my favourite books and adapted by two of my favourite directors, Dune makes me sad. Only sad to realise that one of the most rounded and accurate depictions of medieval feudalism is set 20,000 years in the future. The iconic setting of Dune is immediately recognisable as being Eastern, taking inspiration from ancient Arabian, Levantine and North African cultures, and I'll explore how those influences come out, but ultimately, how the grand politics of the Padishah Empire are at large fundamentally medieval European. So stick around to be immersed in this world which blends sci-fi and fantasy as if there's no distinction, but with a surprising conclusion. The real medieval trappings of the setting are at times more obvious than others, not least of all because the main form of combat is with sword and shield, even if the in-law reason is a bit bonkers. When Frank Herbert in the 1960s began crafting what many consider to be the first major science fiction setting to ever be invented, intelligent depictions of medieval politics were abundant compared to the drought that we have in the 2020s. The Once and Future King by T.H. White had revived Western interest in Arthurian legends, particularly the council members of the famous Knights of the Round Table. And of course, Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings were still fresh off the press. The 60s were just about a golden age of fantasy grounded in reality. Even if King Arthur was not a real person, which you can't actually rule out even if his adventures have been fictionalized, the English nobility during the Age of Chivalry explicitly modelled their conduct and values off of King Arthur's. So any faithful Arthurian story is also a faithful story of real historical knightly kingship, even if in a somewhat back-to-front way. Tolkien wasn't just a fiction author, he was a renowned scholar of medieval English society, particularly the Anglo-Saxon era which he was at the very forefront of study. So when you read or watch Lord of the Rings, you aren't just watching what some people who now take it for granted consider to be the cookie-cutter fantasy universe which really just sets the archetypes for a genre. What you're seeing is fantasy fiction portrayed by someone deeply knowledgeable of and immersed in medieval politics and values. But Tolkien didn't write Dune, so let's get back to Frank Herbert, even though it's so important to understand his contemporary influences. He took a different cultural inspiration and looked further east for the societal structure, religion, and rituals of his universe. The Atreides clan come from a planet highly reminiscent of particularly Scottish Highland inspiration, and I think this for the time in the book when Paul, stuck in the desert, remembers an occasion he found the corpses of two fishermen on a shore, one of which had deep scratch wounds on his shoulders, where his companion, who was wearing spiked boots, had clambered over him trying to survive at his expense. And how peculiar a death by drowning seems in a planet of nothing but sand. Despite the grimness of the tale, this setting places my mind's eye in a picturesque yet dreary Scottish loch, and it can't just be me, as in Denis Villeneuve's film rendition, the Atreides are fans of bagpipes, but a horrible synthetic version which is even more shrill than the real deal. As the story starts, the Atreides are thrust into a foreign land akin to Libya, Iraq, and Persia. The messianic religion of the Fremen people there is not only inspired by Islam and Buddhism, it's actually a literal syncretism of the two, called Zen Sunni, which in the setting took to the stars as its believers spread throughout the galaxy. Herbert doesn't seem so much interested in what the religions of his universe believe in, more so than he does about what they inspire their followers to do. The 60s, after all, were the age of the hippies and the rise of secularism, and I think that we see in Herbert there the start of what you could call the George Carlin approach to religion, which would become the dominant view in Western society as it continued to be more secular from the 60s onwards. But such inspired actions include the rather obviously inspired Butlerian jihad, when humans created artificial intelligence so powerful that it rebelled and nearly wiped out our whole species, where a fanatical holy war had to be waged against it for our very survival. That theme of jihad never goes away in Dune, as Paul is forebodingly pulled along his fateful path to become the messianic saviour of the Fremen, the Lisan al-Gaib, building up a frantic energy which bursts out into the galaxy, conquering everything it touches. But now let's zoom out and examine how politics across the Padishah Empire works, because this is where Herbert really cleverly constructs how his universe actually functions and why those contemporary influences were so important to look at. We've briefly looked at House Atreides, and you likely already know something about House Harkonnen, but above them and the other great houses sits the Padishah Emperor. The great houses form a council called the Landsraad, a collective body of nobility who gather to combine their influence and power together to pursue mutual interests, essentially as a check on power against the emperor. This was the early function of the English Parliament, the House of Lords, set up after the Barons' War in the 13th century against the hated King John, to unite the noble classes together rather than leaving them on their own, able to be crushed by autocratic power. This was then reflected all across Europe, such as the French Estates General and the Holy Roman Empire's Imperial Diet. This is the first outline of a political system you've already heard of called feudalism. When a person hears feudalism, they instantly think serfdom. They're not wrong. A key feature in the European context of feudalism was peasants being tied to land as a matter of contract and ownership by their local lords. But feudalism and serfdom are separate terms for a reason. Serfdom is part of feudalism, not the entirety of it. This fixation on the bottom of the social hierarchy ignores the rest of the system. And I won't defend humans being legally treated as quasi-property, but I will point out that our perception of this time is so heavily driven in this bottom direction due to the influence of Marxism in academia and our cultural tastes. The pure fixation on labour and capital alone blots out a fascinating balance of power at the higher ends of the hierarchy, and I find it more and more fascinating to look at that as we in the modern day watch the balance of power forever shifting in a centralised and managerial direction, and the division of governments into separate branches like the US and UK is utterly failing, as they are institutions protected by laws, words on paper, more so than they are protected by strong leaders acting according to well-oriented incentives. Back in medieval Europe, assemblies of nobles had a remarkable track record at constraining royal authority by limiting taxes, raising armies, and approving or vetoing laws. Similarly, the Landsraad in Dune check the emperor's power, preventing him from ruling as an absolute monarch. For instance, the Landsraad's collective military might could theoretically overwhelm the emperor's Sardaukar, his own private elite army, basically space Chechens, creating a delicate balance of power akin to the tensions between Holy Roman emperors and their electors. The Sardaukar are presented as essentially a nuclear option. If the emperor used them to crush a great house without the consent of the other houses, they would immediately raise the banners and launch a united war against the emperor for overextending his power. But on the inverse, the looming threat of the Sardaukar hangs over the houses like a sword of Damocles. A leader of a great house knows that if he overextends his power beyond the point of support from the Landsraad, the emperor will let slip those hounds of war and restore the balance himself. This is why I praised Herbert's contemporary influences so much in the beginning. It's all too easy for modern fantasy authors and even history authors to just write, kings bad, nobles bad, they are all big meanies, because they just are, in complete ignorance of how kings and nobles actually operated, because it's this right here. To go mask off on you now, my most viewed video is called Monarchy is Better Than Democracy, and a main reason I believe that is we're completely lied to from cradle to grave that democracy equals peace and decentralization of power. Yet the democratic American empire is the largest, most powerful, most warlike, and most impregnable the world has ever seen. So try to put that square peg in that round hole for me. Yet the Holy Roman Empire, some may say despite calling itself an empire, but I would say in virtue of just being honest with itself, was in fact the most decentralized political conglomerate I think the world has ever seen. And it lasted 1,000 years, making it the longest in history if, like I do, you separate the Roman Empire and the Byzantine Empire. And the nature of the houses shows even more depth of character to the Landsraad. We see at the beginning of the story that the House Atreides are removed from their ancestral homeworld of Caladan, a royal fiefdom granted to their care by the Emperor since time immemorial. And this removal throws the entire dynamic of the house into disarray, exactly as House Harkonnen planned. As in the historical counterparts, the life, compass, and purpose of a noble house is explicitly tied to their land. An English baron, a French duke, a German count would feel themselves tied by honour, duty, and blood to their home. They would be incentivized to bring long-term peace and prosperity to the people of their land in their charge, as if destruction and poverty befell the land and their people suffered, they suffered with them. Yes, they certainly didn't suffer as much as the peasants, but the point stands, as the better off the people, the better off the nobles, and vice versa. House Harkonnen does not abide by such incentives. They don't have a European historical counterpart, as this is fiction after all, and they are written to be the pure embodiment of human evil. I'll discuss in a later video how the books portray the nature of their evil a lot better than the recent films. The Harkonnens for the longest time controlled Arrakis, but had no connection or duty of care towards the planet. They didn't live there. They didn't protect the people, they didn't invest in growth. They merely viewed it as a distant resource to exploit. They sound much like the merchant or managerial class, who in our own time have subverted the rule of nobles. They are rootless people forever moving around, disconnected from the society under their control. Their only duty seemingly being that which maximizes hedonistic pleasure for themselves. You can decide if I'm talking about the Harkonnens or merchants there. On this topic, another key source of influence in the Padishah Empire is economic, particularly through CHOAM, a cartel that allocates wealth among houses, the emperor, and other factions. CHOAM mirrors medieval merchant guilds or the Hanseatic League, where economic power translated directly into political influence, often rivaling noble authority. Merchants rose rapidly in influence as Europeans entered the Age of Sail, and they explored the world for gold, materials, and land. Such was the level of their power that still today the influence of merchant guilds is an active part of London's political life. There's a rabbit hole for you to go down. Guilds were granted monopolies by the royalty over their industry and in turn funded the royal treasury lavishly. This was starkly the most blindingly corrupt corner of European political systems.
How much will it cost them, traveling all this way for this formality?
3 guild navigators, a total of 1.46 million, 62 salaries round trip.
But I think Herbert again shows this in a great way, as CHOAM, the guild granted monopoly over the spice trade, and the Spacing Guild, the one granted monopoly over space travel which relies on spice, are deeply hated by the nobility and even the emperor. It shows the vicious cycle of government involvement in big business, as once advantageous protection from market competition takes root in a company, they become monopolies much harder to check than any royal or noble power, as both royal and noble estates end up relying on the monopoly to survive, meaning that shareholders can end up more powerful than dukes through the guarded exploitation of necessary resources, all of which puts me in mind of this haunting picture. It means that houses and the emperor must be subservient to CHOAM, who essentially have a big red button. Do what CHOAM wants, or you get no spice. That's the equivalent of no oil in our world. You simply cannot run a country without it, so whoever controls it, in reality, controls your country. Do you see now why anybody who disrupts the petrodollar system doesn't seem to last very long? Finally, the Bene Gesserit are the last major group, and I struggle to place them in a European context. Many pundits will say that they are the Catholic Church. Yes, I'm biased, but I do disagree. They do serve some function of that institution by guiding beliefs, but in the hippy-dippy Dan Carlin view of doing it in the shadows and only for nefarious purposes, which, sorry, unless you're an edgelord, doesn't really match up. Examples that are given include Pope Leo III crowning Charlemagne and therefore supposedly meddling in worldly affairs, but in reality, Charlemagne was so powerful that the event was the result of him meddling in church affairs. That's not the dynamic we see of the Bene Gesserit. They seem the institution most distinctly African to me. A congregation of wise women, you could even say witches, using feminine techniques to influence the masculine domain of high-stakes politics. It is again a clever use of themes and balanced power dynamics where a lazier author would just put a girl boss in armor who could beat men single-handedly. Then they'll jump up and down over how Saint Joan of Arc wore armor, but then ignore that she was a teenager and never fought anyone in it. And yes, Cheney gets stuck in with combat, but in guerrilla tactics and ambushes designed for asymmetrical warfare, not toe-to-toe duels. Credit must be given to Herbert there for doing this in a sensible yet compelling way. And still, there remains so much more to be said about Dune. It's a long series and has some great film adaptations, and House Harkonnen have only been mentioned here in passing. If you've enjoyed this exploration, then do be sure to subscribe, as all of that will be addressed in due course. Take it easy.